Imagine the heavy, suffocating weight of an oven wrapped in a wet wool blanket. That is the air of Central Florida in August. Now, put on a high-collared, heavy blue wool uniform, strap 40 pounds of gear, a canteen, and a 9-pound Springfield musket to your back, and step into black water that reaches your waist. The water smells of ancient, decomposing vegetation and sulfur. The razor-sharp edges of the sawgrass slice through your trousers, leaving hundreds of microscopic paper cuts across your thighs that instantly fill with stagnant, bacteria-rich mud. Above you, the Spanish moss hangs from the live oaks like the ragged shrouds of dead men. You cannot see the horizon. You cannot see the enemy. You can only hear the deafening, maddening drone of a million mosquitoes and the erratic, terrified splashing of the man in front of you. You were told this was going to be a swift, punitive expedition. You were told that the United States Army, a modern, disciplined, European-style military machine, would march down, intimidate a few scattered bands of indigenous people, and be back in Washington for a parade. You were lied to. You have just waded into the 19th century equivalent of the American Vietnam. As the Surgeon General of the United States Army would later write in a classified assessment of the campaign, "The climate is a more deadly enemy than the Indian. Our troops are subjected to a toxic atmosphere, wading through swamps generating poisonous miasma, where the very act of drawing a breath is an invitation to the grave." My name is Nathaniel Blackwood. Today we are conducting a raw anatomical examination of the Second Seminole War. We are stripping away the sanitized Hollywood illusions of frontier glory to look at a 7-year survival horror. We are going to break down how a brilliant guerrilla syndicate and a ruthless, predatory environment ground the American military apparatus into the mud, leaving behind nothing but unmarked graves and the only indigenous nation to never surrender. The machinery of this catastrophe was set into motion by a piece of paper. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, a legislative mandate to clear the eastern United States of its native populations and march them to the barren dust of Oklahoma. For the tribes of the Southeast, this was the Trail of Tears. But down in the dense, subtropical labyrinth of the Florida Territory, the Seminole people looked at the eviction notice and flatly refused. The Seminoles were not an ancient, static tribe. They were a fiercely independent amalgamation of Creek refugees, escaped African slaves, the Black Seminoles, and remnants of older Florida tribes. They had built a thriving, autonomous society in the swamps. When the U.S. government presented the Treaty of Paynes Landing in 1832, a document designed to legally steal their land, the response was not diplomatic. The legend, backed by the oral histories of the time, states that the young, charismatic war leader Osceola approached the table where the federal Indian agent sat. Osceola did not ask for a quill. He drew his hunting knife, raised it above his head, and drove the steel straight through the treaty, pinning it to the oak table. "This," he supposedly declared, "is the only treaty I will ever make with the white man." The United States responded with the arrogance typical of a rising empire. They dispatched the regular army, assuming that a display of cannons, dragoons, and marching columns would instantly shatter the native resistance. They fundamentally misunderstood the theater of war. They brought a Napoleonic doctrine into a prehistoric swamp. The logistical collapse was instantaneous and absolute. To wage a traditional war, an army needs supply lines. They need roads for their heavy, iron-axled wagons, their massive caissons of artillery, and their slow-moving herds of beef cattle. Florida has no roads. It is a vast, interconnected sponge of limestone, muck, and wetlands. The quartermaster reports from the first years of the war read like the desperate dispatches of a doomed expedition. One quartermaster noted, "Our transport is entirely paralyzed. Wagons sink to their beds in the treacherous sands and mud. Horses rupture their hearts, attempting to pull them free. Our salt pork spoils within 48 hours of opening the barrels, turning rancid in the infernal humidity. And our hard bread is consumed by a green mold before it reaches the mouths of the men." The American soldiers were tethered to these sinking wagons. They moved at a crawl, exhausted before they even saw combat, hacking blindly through the palmetto scrub with machetes. In stark contrast, the Seminoles operated on a system of frictionless, aquatic mobility. Their primary vehicle was the dugout canoe, a vessel carved from a single massive cypress log. These canoes could glide silently through water just 6 inches deep. A Seminole war party could carry 50 pounds of dried venison, coontie root flour, and lead in a canoe, traverse 50 miles of the Everglades in a single night, and hide the boat beneath the sawgrass before dawn. They moved like water moccasins over the very terrain that was swallowing the U.S. Army alive. Osceola and the Seminole leadership understood a cold, tactical truth. If you meet a superior industrial force on an open field, you will be destroyed. Therefore, there would be no open fields. There would be no lines of battle. There would only be the ambush, the sniper, and the terror of the unseen. The Seminoles waged a masterclass in psychological and asymmetrical warfare. They dictated the terms of every single engagement. They would wait for an American column to stretch itself thin along a narrow, muddy trail, bogged down by their heavy wool coats and sinking boots. Then, the swamp would explode. A volley of musket fire would erupt from the dense thickets of cabbage palms and oak scrub. The accuracy of the Seminole warriors was terrifying. They targeted the officers first, dropping the men on horseback to shatter the chain of command, then targeted the artillerymen to silence the cannons. Before the American soldiers could form a line, fix bayonets, and fire a blind return volley into the trees, the Seminoles were gone. They dissolved into the Spanish moss and the deep mud, leaving the soldiers to fire at shadows. Captain John T. Sprague, an American officer who served in the grueling campaign, documented the sheer frustration of fighting this invisible enemy in his diaries. "They are here, and they are nowhere. A commander may scour a hammock for days, finding nothing but the tracks of a deer, only to have his rear guard decimated by a foe that seems to rise from the very mud itself. They possess a capacity for concealment that defies European comprehension. I have seen evidence of warriors submerging themselves entirely in the black water for hours, breathing only through a hollow reed, waiting for our patrols to pass within inches of their hidden blades. This wasn't a war of conquest. It was a war of attrition. The most famous example of this was the Dade Massacre in December 1835. Major Francis Dade was leading a column of 110 men from Fort Brooke, modern-day Tampa, to Fort King, Ocala. They were marching through an area of open pine barrens, thinking they were safe. They were wrong. Osceola's allies, led by Chiefs McCanopy and Jumper, had shadowed them for days. When the Americans reached a patch of high saw palmettos, the Seminoles opened fire. The first volley wiped out half the command, including Major Dade. The surviving soldiers desperately tried to build a crude triangular breastwork out of pine logs, but they were pinned down, picked off one by snipers hidden in the grass. Of the 110 American soldiers, only 3 survived, crawling away severely wounded. The psychological toll on the U.S. Army was devastating. The soldiers were not fighting men. They felt they were fighting the forest itself. They spent weeks marching through waist-deep water, waiting for the sudden crack of a rifle, unable to sleep, unable to dry their rotting boots, jumping at every snap of a twig. The stress broke the minds of farm boys from Ohio and New York who had never seen an alligator, let alone a warrior who could vanish into a fog bank. But Osceola's warriors were not the deadliest force in Florida. The Seminoles had a silent, microscopic ally that inflicted more casualties on the United States military than every musket ball and arrow combined. The environment was a systemic meat grinder. The U.S. Army built a network of crude wooden forts across the interior of Florida to serve as supply depots and garrisons. These forts, built of green, unseasoned pine logs, were erected directly in the middle of stagnant, mosquito-infested swamps. They became isolated incubators for disease. To look at the official medical ledgers of the Second Seminole War is to look at a clinical breakdown of the human frame. Out of the approximately 2,500 United States soldiers who died during the 7-year campaign, only about 300 were killed in combat. Over 1,200 men died from disease. The primary executioner was malaria, known then as the ague, or swamp fever. The Americans did not yet understand that the disease was carried by the Anopheles mosquito. They believed it was caused by miasma, bad air rising from the rotting vegetation. The men were bitten by the thousands every single night. The progression of the disease is a brutal physical dismantling. It begins with a violent, bone-rattling chill. A soldier would sit beside a roaring fire in the sweltering Florida heat, wrapped in 3 blankets, his teeth chattering so hard they cracked. Then comes the fever, pushing the core temperature to 105 degrees. The red blood cells burst, clogging the kidneys and the liver. The men lay in the crude, suffocating wooden hospitals, sweating through their cots, their skin turning a sickly, jaundiced yellow as their organs failed. If malaria didn't kill them, yellow fever did. Transmitted by the Aedes aegypti mosquito, yellow fever induces a catastrophic hemorrhagic collapse. The virus attacks the liver, preventing the blood from clotting. The soldiers would suffer agonizing joint pain, followed by the terrifying hallmark of the disease, the black vomit. They would literally vomit up the coagulated blood leaking into their own stomachs. They bled from their gums, their noses, and their eyes, and dying in a state of toxic delirium. And beneath the fevers was the constant, grinding misery of dysentery. Clean water was a luxury that did not exist on the march. Desperate, heat-exhausted soldiers drank directly from stagnant cypress swamps, ingesting amoebas and bacteria. The resulting intestinal infection stripped the lining of their bowels. Men died of sheer dehydration, passing pure blood and mucus, screaming in agony while surrounded by millions of gallons of undrinkable water. The Surgeon General's reports painted a grim picture of these wilderness outposts. The hospitals at Fort King and Fort Drane are overflowing with the wretched wrecks of men. The stench of dysentery and gangrene hangs over the palisades. We are not treating a fighting force. We are maintaining a hospice for the doomed. The climate is melting the flesh from their bones faster than the enemy can shoot them. The Seminoles, meanwhile, had lived in this environment for generations. They possessed generational knowledge of the terrain. They knew where the clear springs were, and they understood the medicinal herbs necessary to combat the fevers. The swamp was their fortress. To the Americans, it was a graveyard. As the years dragged on, the war became a massive, bleeding ulcer on the federal budget. The United States government poured resources into Florida with an escalating sense of desperation. They deployed bloodhounds imported from Cuba to track the warriors through the swamps. The hounds either died of the heat or were killed by the Seminoles. They deployed flat-bottomed gunboats. They burned native crops. Nothing worked. The war consumed the careers of the finest officers in the U.S. military. 3 commanding generals, Edmund Gaines, Winfield Scott, and Thomas Jessup, were either disgraced or frustrated to the breaking point by their inability to corner the enemy. General Jessup became so desperate that he abandoned the fundamental rules of civilized warfare. In October 1837, Osceola approached an American encampment under a white flag of truce to negotiate the release of prisoners. Jessup ordered his men to surround Osceola, strike him over the head, and bind him in chains. It was a staggering violation of international military ethics, a cowardly capture that shocked the American public and turned Osceola into a martyr. Osceola would die of a throat infection in a damp prison cell in South Carolina a few months later. But even the treacherous capture of their most famous leader did not break the Seminoles. Other chiefs, Cocucci, Wildcat, Sam Jones, and Billy Bowlegs, stepped into the vacuum, leading the American army deeper into the impenetrable sawgrass of the deep Everglades. By 1842, the United States had reached its breaking point. The Second Seminole War had cost the federal treasury an estimated $40,000. To put that in perspective, the entire budget of the United States government in 1835 was roughly $18 million. They had spent more than double the nation's annual income trying to clear a swamp of a few thousand people, and they had failed. There was no grand surrender. There was no treaty signed on a battleship. The United States simply realized they could not win the physics of the environment. In 1842, Congress passed the Armed Occupation Act, declaring the war over without actually achieving their objective. The Army quietly packed up its rotting tents, loaded its emaciated, malaria-stricken survivors onto ships, and sailed away. A few thousand Seminoles had been captured and sent west, but a core group of a few hundred retreated into the deepest, most inaccessible heart of the Everglades, the Big Cypress Swamp. The U.S. Army refused to follow them in. They left them alone. We look back at the history of the 19th century, and we are fed a narrative of unstoppable industrial progress. We are taught that the frontier was a wild beast that was inevitably tamed by the railroad, the telegraph, and the sheer willpower of the American soldier. But if you look at the mud of Central Florida, you see the hard, unyielding limit of that progress. The Second Seminole War was not a tale of heroic cavalry charges. It was a 7-year masterclass in human endurance and tactical brilliance by a people who refused to be erased. The Seminoles weaponized the heat, they weaponized the water, and they weaponized the very insects of the air. They forced a modern superpower to realize that all the cannons and military academies in the world are useless when the ground beneath your feet is trying to eat you. To this day, the Seminole tribe of Florida holds a title that no other native group in North America can claim. They are the unconquered. They never signed a formal peace treaty with the United States government ending the war. They didn't have to. They beat the machine until the machine gave up and walked away. The next time you walk through the humid air of a Florida evening, listen to the buzzing of the mosquitoes and look at the dark water reflecting the moon. Understand that you are looking at an undefeated defensive perimeter. You are looking at a swamp that swallowed an army and the ghosts of the men who knew exactly how to use it. My name is Nathaniel Blackwood, and history is never what you think.